Today's daf we're going to be learning is Sanhedrin Daf Sam Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Gabrielle and Daniel Altman in loving memory of Honorable Miriam Altman. Miriam Bat Shalom was a Chonah Lebracha. It's been 20 years without her, and her love and wisdom still guides our every path. We're going to get started with I want to talk about something from yesterday that someone asked after class, and I went and looked it up, and I have what to say about it. I remember that it came up, but I didn't remember after class exactly what it was. But now I want to go back to a very interesting topic. We talked a lot yesterday. We repeated many, many times this idea that if you go to Beit Knesset, you think it's a Beit Knesset and you bow down, right? That's not considered anything. Or you go to an Andarta and you bow out of respect. It's not anything. And the question really that someone asked was, well, what happened to Yereg Va'al Yavor? When it comes to Avodah Zarah, and we're going to get to the sugya in about 2 weeks, which is when it comes, someone says, go worship idols, you have to get killed or will kill you. Better to get killed than to worship idols. Now, worshiping idols, you obviously don't intend in your heart to worship the idol. You don't view it as an idol. You're doing it just because they want it, right? They are forcing you to do it. So wouldn't that come into this category that you shouldn't be obligated at all? And that if you're not going to be obligated, then why is it forbidden to do? So the Ritva addresses exactly this question. And the Ritva says that if they force you to bow down, right? The reason why you have to do Yareg Val Yavor is basically, he says, because from here, the issue is not that you're actually worshiping idols. The issue there is Chilul Hashem. They're making a public display of Jews worshiping idols. So it doesn't matter what's in your heart because it's actually, which is fascinating, it's actually not Avodah Zarah. Okay? But you still can't do it because the Chilul Hashem. That's interesting. Anyway, I wanted to start with that. I hope that answered your question, Tina. Okay, so at least it's one approach. Now we're going to get back to our daf. What we dealt with for the most part yesterday was this two versions of Rabbi Zakai and this whole thing about if you do a number of actions, with then you didn't realize it was all forbidden, and then you find out it is, how many sin offerings you have to bring. One or many. So we saw in the middle of the second version, we quoted that perhaps Rabbi Zakai was just holding like Rabbi Ami, who says exactly that you're only chayav one. So now we're going to go to that. Gufa. We're going to go in depth into what he says. Amar Rabbi Ami zibach v'kitel v'nisech be'alem echad, eno chayav ela echad. That's Amar Abaye. So here he says it, right? This is exactly what we said yesterday. Rabbi Ami says you're only chayav one, even though everything else seemed to indicate you're chayav more. Amar Abaye my time to Rabbi Ami. So Abaye says, what's the reason for Rabbi Ami? What's his source? Amar Kra lo ta'avdem. He says his source is lo ta'avdem. That was in the 10 Commandments that we just read in Shul. Lo ta'avdem, don't worship them. That's a one term that includes a bunch of things. Hakatuv sa'an kulan avodah achat. Okay, so the pasuk makes them all really like one issue. So if you forgot that all these things were asur, it's really only one issue, and therefore you only bring one korban chatat. That's how Abaye explains Rabbi Ami. Umi amar Abaye hachi, but wait, how can Abaye say this? Doesn't Abaye say, Hamar Abaye, shalosh shachavaot b'avodah zara lama? Why do we need 3 different psukim to say don't bow down to idols? Okay, it appears 3 times in the Torah. Echad lekedarka, echad shalo kedarka, echad lechalek. One is if you worship the idol, you bow down in the way this, if everyone bows down to that idol, kedarka. One is to say, even if nobody bows down to this idol normally, and you do, you're still obligated. And the third is lechalek, which is our topic, that you have to bring separate korbanot chatat for each action. So if Abaye says that, how could he be explaining Rabbi Ami, who says otherwise? To which the Gemara answers the obvious question, the obvious answer, Lidvarav Rabbi Ami kamar v'leilo svirale. Abaye was just being respectful and saying, oh, I disagree with him, but I know what his source is. I can bring a source for his opinion, but it doesn't mean I hold this way. And this is like an interesting way, something that we can all learn from about how to have to engage in debate with people and disagree with their opinions, but also see their side and also understand where they're coming from. And this Abaye shows us, and it comes up a lot in the Gemara. Gufa. Now that we mentioned Abaye, let's understand what he was talking about. Gufa amar Abaye shalosh shtachavot b'avodah zara lama echad lekedarka echad shelo kedarka echad lechalek. So the truth is, we understand what he's talking about. We explained it. But the Gemara is going to raise a problem. Lechedarka, the fact that you're obligated to do certain actions, right? Let's say whether it's bowing or whether it's kissing or whatever it is, if that's the way that idol is worshipped, Well, we already learned that yesterday from a different pasuk. Remember? Mi echaya abdua goyim ha'ela nafka. That's learned from a pasuk that says, right, when you get into the land and and you start to say, how did they worship their idols so that you can do it that way? Right? Obviously, that's forbidden. So we get that from a different pasuk. We don't need a pasuk about bowing to teach us that. Ella echad kidarka v'shelo kidarka. Okay, one of them is teaching you kidarka and shelo kidarka. Okay, this is a little confusing what exactly this means. So Rashi explains that what does it mean? And then one is shelo kedarka and one is lechalek. So what's the difference? Why do we have one that's kedarka but shelo kedarka? One is shelo kedarka entirely. So Rashi explains that there's a difference between, let's say, the way you normally worship this idol is by kissing, but then you do it by bowing, right? So that's shelo kedarka. Right, but let's say it's markulis or where the general way. Now, normally, what do we say? As long as you're bowing in a way that's respectful, you're going to be obligated, right? That's really shelo kedarka, but you're doing it in the way that generally that idol is worshipped. I'm sorry, you're doing it in a respectful way. In other words, if I bow to an idol that's normally kissed, but because bowing is a respectful thing, I'm going to be obligated. But there's also a case like Markulis and Baal Pa'ol where the way to worship him is a disrespectful way, either by defecating or by throwing rocks. So you might have thought you need a separate pasuk to teach you that if you bow down and do them in a respectful way, you're still going to be obligated by bowing or slaughtering or any of those main actions that you're obligated shelo kedarka, even if it's not the way you generally bow to that idol and not the whole, not even the type of way, meaning it's respectful way rather than a disgraceful way, you're still going to be obligated. Okay, and that's what he learns from those, but not kedarka, lo kedarka, and that because kedarka is already learned from a different place. Hamikablo alav be'eloha ha'omer lo eliyata. Now we're continuing in the Mishnah, moving to another topic. And today it's going to be a lot about words and speech and what's the status of saying something. We've learned many times in the Gemara that there's a difference always between an action and an action that involves words, which we don't exactly call an action. So here, the Mishnah clearly says this is an action. The Mishnah says, "Hamikablo alav be'eloha." We're just quoting the Mishnah we already learned. Ha'omer lo eliyata. One of the ways you get killed by worshiping idols is by saying, "I accept you as my God." You say, "Eliyata, you're my God," to the idol. You get killed. Okay, fine. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Rav, it makes sense in this context, right? You're basically accepting another God upon you. But now we have a strange statement because Rav Nachman says in the name of Rav Ravua, says in the name of Rav, Kevan she'amar lo eliyata chayav. Since you said, or if you say, eliyata, you're my God, you're obligated. Now, why is this strange? Well, the Mishna said it, so it doesn't sound strange, but of course it does, because what's the role of a moraim? The role of a moraim is not to quote the Mishnayot, not by quoting the Mishnah, but just saying, oh, I have this halacha to tell you all when it says it in the Mishnah. So there's no point for Rav Nachman to bring a statement of Rav that Rav just said exactly what it says in the Mishnah. They just don't do that. It's not the way the Amoraim work. So the Gemara asks Lamai, well, what's he talking about? Chayav. Now, chayav is a very general term. In the Mishnah, it was clear chayav meant killed. Because why? Well, we're in the Mishnayot of Eluhena Niskalin. These are the people who get stoned. So the topic was death. Today we're going to talk about a few different punishments. There's death. There's sin offering, which you do when you do an act unwittingly. That was all yesterday's topic. And usually it's something that has karet associated with it, though not always. And then there's malko, lashes. We're going to get to that next. But right now, the Gemara is going to say, so iliktala matnitini. If it's death, that you're chayiv the death penalty, well, the Mishnah already said that. Ela lekorban. It must be if you did it unwittingly. What it would be exactly that you said you're my God. Maybe you thought it was God and it wasn't God, or representing God. I don't know. It's hard to know exactly what the case would have been, but you do it somehow unwittingly, or you didn't know it was forbidden, I guess, to say that, right? We learned that's also, that would be unwitting. So, like Shigagat Avodah Zarah, you just didn't know Avodah Zarah was forbidden by the Torah, and you said Eliyata, and then you find out it is, so you'd have to bring a sacrifice. Now they say Vafilu the Rabbanan, even according to the rabbis. Now, what are we talking about? We don't know, but there's apparently machloket between Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis about words. And the machloket between them is about a migadef. It comes up in the beginning of Kritut, which is the place where it talks about chayve karet. And Chayve karet, if you do them unwittingly, okay, there's something that, according to the Torah, you're chayve karet. You do it unwittingly, you have to bring a korban. And there's a machloket, you bring a korban if you curse God. Why? Because cursing God is just moving your lips, which isn't really an action, okay? So there's a machloket there. Now, we're going to see that they're not just associating with the machloket, but the way Reish Lakish understands the machloket. Today, we're not going to talk about Rabbi Yochanan, but there's a bit of a different way to understand the machloket. But we're going to read it the way Reish Lakish understands it. In Daf Samachay, they're going to refer back to this machloket, so we'll see Rabbi Yochanan's perspective on it. But right now, they're going to quote, okay, in order to understand this position of the rabbis that's in Kritu, it's a little confusing, we're going to quote some Braita about Avodah Zarah. From there, we're going to have what Reish Lakish comments on it. And Reish Lakish says this must be according to Rabbi Akiva, which allows us to understand how Reish Lakish understood their machloket. That's why we're bringing this. So it's a little confusing, but we'll get there in a minute. And then we're going to say, doesn't sound like what Rav's saying correlates to the rabbi's position. And that's really the question. So Hatanya, here's the bright. And from here, we're going to see how Reish Lakish understands Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis, machloket. And we're back to Avodah Zarah, even though there it was talking about cursing God. Here we're in Avodah Zarah in the Braita. As their machloket is said about cursing God. What Reish Lakish is going to do is apply their machloket about cursing God to something that has to do with idols. V'hatanya eino chayav ela al davar sheyesh bo maaseh. It says in a Braita, you're only liable on something that has an action associated with it. And here we're actually talking about Avodah Zarah. Kigon zibuach v'kitur v'nisuch v'ishtachava'ah. Now they're not talking here about words. It's a little confusing. They're bringing in Avodah Zarah not because we need it for Avodah Zarah. They're bringing in Avodah Zarah because from that Braita, Reish Lakish commented about the machloket Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis, and then we're going to apply it to our case. So it says here, you're only chayav if you actually do an action, like slaughtering, right? Kitur, the incense, offering incense, nisuch, libation, or bowing. Now, the issue here is that bowing, you might not have thought this, but bowing is also not really an action. All you did was bend your knees down. Like slaughtering is a real action. Incense, action. Libation, action. Bowing is sort of not really an action because you just move your knees down. It's like an action, what do you call it? Like a light action. So Reish Lakish says, I'm a Reish Lakish, man tanei shtachava. Who's the one who mentioned bowing in this Braita? And who thinks that you're obligated to sacrifice for bowing? Rabbi Akiva, ta'amal lo be'ina ma'aseh. So it must be Rabbi Akiva, he says, who doesn't require a ma'aseh. Because even in words alone, in the Megadef case, again, that's how he understands the machloket, Megadef brings a korban even though it's just words. And then the rabbis say, oh no, it's just words. You don't bring a korban for that. And that they learned from the bowing, right? I think what you're saying is, I like that. It's an immaterial action. Like nothing changes when you bow, right? You slaughter an animal, the animal is not the same. You offer libation, you put something somewhere else. You bow, you just move down and you stand up again. And it's as if it never happened, really. Nothing was changed by what you did. Thanks for clarifying that. So now they say, Michlal, from there you can infer from Rabbi Akiva. If it's only Rabbi Akiva who says you don't need an action, Michlal, the Rabbanan Savre Be'ina Maseh. It sounds like the rabbis say you need an action. Now, they weren't talking about words, but words are also considered in many sugyot in the Gemara, alav she'en bo maseh, right? It comes up in other things. If you speak and it's a sin that doesn't have an action and a negative commandment, you wouldn't get lashes for it. We're going to talk about that later today, actually. But right now, we're not in that sugya, but we're here. And we want to know korban. So when it comes to sacrifice, according to the rabbis, you wouldn't bring a sacrifice on words. So this statement of Rav, could it work according to the rabbis? Because it would be strange that Rav would just pick Rabbi Akiva's position, but in the end, they're going to say, yeah, he does. Ki ka'amar Rav, not me the Rabbi Akiva ka'amar. In other words, Rav really was only talking according to Rabbi Akiva, because you're not going to be liable for words alone according to the rabbis, and therefore, if you say liyata, you won't bring a korban. Now, you might be forbidden to do things, but it doesn't mean that there's a korban associated with it. By the way, I want to also point out, I forgot to mention this. When I started class about the Yareg Val Yavor, they also say there, the comment I was reading, that it's also forbidden, even though you might not get the death penalty for it, it's forbidden to do. So there's also, right, that it could be it's forbidden, even though you don't get a punishment. Okay, so that's also. So it doesn't mean you are allowed to say Eliata. It just means you won't have to bring a korban according to the rabbis. So now, because this is all punishment, not necessarily what's permitted or forbidden, right? Not every time something's forbidden is there going to be a punishment for it. Like a lav she'ein bo ma'aseh, you've clearly transgressed a negative commandment, but you just not might be able to get lashes, for example. Okay, that's also a differentiation that's important to make. So now they say, now, the Rabbi Akiva, okay, if Rabbi Akiva obligates a migadef, someone who curses God, well then, the Rabbi Akiva pshita, hainu migadef, right? What's the difference between cursing God and what's the difference between saying to an idol, you're my God, okay? Now, obviously, it's a different action, but the point is, if he obligates a migadef for speech, he's obviously going to obligate here, in which case, we're back to square one. Why did Rav need to tell us this? If I know Rabbi Akiva says that, then I know Rabbi Akiva will say the same thing by us. Doesn't need a special statement to say such a thing. To which the Gemara says, no, amau detema. What's amau detema? You might have thought this, therefore Rav needed to tell you. Mau detema ad kan lo chayev Rabbi Akiva korban ela b'megadef. Maybe specifically by the megadef, it's obvious there's a korban. And this goes back to something I mentioned earlier, which is usually when there's karet, then you do it unwittingly, you get shkaga. So there, by megadef in the Torah, there's tivbe karet. There's chiyuv karet. Again, what's karet? It's some sort of death by the hands of God. We don't know exactly what it is because it's in the hands of God, right? There's different attempts to try to say what is karet. You get cut off before your time, or a child dies before the parent, but we don't really know what karet is. But it says karet there by megadef, and therefore it would go hand in hand with, if you do it unwittingly, you'll have to bring a korban. Even though it's just speech. But in Avodah Zarah, it never says karet. So maybe since there's no karet associated with it, you would think that you don't have to bring a sin offering. Kamash malan. Therefore, it comes to teach you. And now we're going to quote a pasuk from Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf. And we're going to explain how we're going to assume Rav understands that Rabbi Akiva would apply it here. For what reason? Itakush. There's a hekesh. What's a hekesh? When things are juxtaposed in the verse, we can learn from one to the other. Now, everybody agrees if you slaughter to Avodah Zarah, for example, and you do it unwittingly, you will have to bring a sin offering. So in the same pasuk it says, Dichtiv, what it says, Vayishtachavulo, they bow down to the idol, Vayizbechulo, they slaughtered for it, Vayomru, and they said, El Elohecha Yisrael, right? This is the God of Israel that took, or the gods of Israel, we're going to talk about that verse in 1 minute, that took us out of Egypt. So what do you see here? There was bowing, which already was a bit of a debate, but there was slaughtering, and there were words. So from here you learn, just like the slaughtering, you have to bring a sin offering also for bowing, which wasn't our topic really, but we did mention it, and also specifically for speech. Okay, and that's where Rav gets it from, and that's why Rav has to tell you, because otherwise you would have thought, well, there's no karet, maybe you wouldn't have to bring a sin offering, but he says you do. Okay, so that was all to explain Rav's position, which took us a while to figure out. Rav's position, which only accords with Rabbi Akiva, that if you say Eliata, you're obligated a sacrifice if you did it unwittingly. Now, since we mentioned this pasuk, we're going to quote the end of the pasuk about heelucha. These are Elohecha Yisrael. They said about the golden calf that took us out of Egypt, but the word heelucha is plural, as if there's gods that took us out. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Umalei vav shebehelucha. If you didn't have that vav in the middle of it, it would be heelcha. Heelcha would be single. So why does it help that it was plural? Well, he's going to say, if it weren't for that vav, nitchayvu sonehem shel Yisrael klaya. Literally, this means the enemies of the Jewish people would have been wiped out. But what it really means is the Jewish people would have been wiped out. They just don't like to say the Jewish people will be wiped out. So they say the enemies of the Jewish people will be wiped out. This is what, we do these euphemisms. We don't want to say them as they are. Why? Because what he's saying is they didn't deny God. They said God and other gods brought us out of Egypt. And that plural saved them. Because if they said, this is what took us out of Egypt, that would be denying God completely, and that would be terrible. But the Gemara says, kitinai, right? And then that would have been the end of us. But the Gemara says, what do you mean? It's a machloket tanaim. Some people say that would have been worse, what you just explained. Let's read it. Achirim omrim, others say, ilmalei vav shebehelucha nitchayvu sonehem shel Yisrael klaya. That's what we just said. That's the first opinion. But the second opinion is Amar lo Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says to him, the Acherim, usually they say Acherim is Rabbi Meir. I don't know if that is here, but Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, V'halo kol mishatef shem shamayim v'davar acher ne'ekar min ha'olam. It's forbidden in the same phrase to include God and idols, right? That is worse to God. Okay, it's much worse to say God and the idols took us out of Egypt because it's putting them on the same level. How do we know this? Shenema, what's the pasuk? Bilti la Hashem livado. Right, that's you can't worship idols. You can only worship God Himself. We saw this before. God alone. God's name can only be mentioned alone. You can't mention it together with names of idols. So elamatom lomar asher heelucha. So what does he do with that pasuk? How does he understand it? She'ivu elohot harbe. They wanted a lot of gods. What they wanted was basically they wanted intermediaries. It wasn't enough for them to just have God. They wanted these idols to help them. Like the way you view it, it's a hierarchy. God is at the top. They didn't deny God, but they wanted intermediaries. That's why the whole thing also comes up with the malach after that, the angel, and the angel will go with you. But they needed intermediaries. They wanted something to be in between them and God, under God, though. They weren't denying God. And the heelucha, which is plural, was the gods that are plural, not our God. Our God wasn't referred to in that passage because that really would have destroyed the Jewish people. So here we have a debate about this issue. Now we're moving on to the next section. These are 4 actions, and there's more of them in the Mishna. It says if you do these actions, only if it's the way people worship that idol. Hugging, kissing, sweeping, pouring water to clean. That was the way they would pour water on the floor to clean the floor so the dust would settle. That's the mirabetz. Then there was also noder b'shmo, vowing in the God's name, and also swearing. All those we said are negative commandments. You don't get the death penalty for them. And this is where lashes is going to come up. So we assume, what do you get for them? Lashes. But now we're going to have, and this is interesting in terms of, I always call it like a bit of a game of broken telephone, which is the Misarot from Israel would get to Babylonia, and often they would get cut off or messed up along the way. So they would bring Torah of Eretz Israel, and then, someone would bring and say, this is what the rabbi said, and someone else would say, this is what the rabbi said. They each heard something different, or they each remembered it differently, or whatever it might be. So here we're going to have 2 different versions of, there's a split in the Mishnah. We don't know exactly where the split is, okay? What we know where it is, we're going to divide between the ones that are speech-oriented, okay, vows and oaths, versus the others, which are actual actions. Now, you can guess where this is going. And if you didn't know too much, you would definitely say this is the right way to say it. Ki ata Rav Dimi, Amar Rabbi Elazar, al kulam lokeh. So when Rav Dimi came from Israel to Babylonia, he brought the Torah of Rabbi Elazar, who was one of the prize students of Rabbi Yochanan. And most of the Torah in Israel all dates back to Rabbi Yochanan. Okay? Al kulam lokeh chutz mehanodir b'shmo v'makayim b'shmo. You're going to get lashes on all of these except for those 2. And that fits in exactly what I've been telling you. Lav she'ein bo ma'aseh. There's no action associated with it. It's just words alone, even though obviously we know words are actions. Words cause problems. Words, right? People wrote before about slander. It's an issue that they grapple with all the time in the Gemara. We're always going back. Words, actions, what's the interplay between them? But those 2 not. Okay? And we assume it's because Lav she'ein bo ma'aseh. So the Gemara asks, wait a minute, something doesn't work here. Mishna hanoder b'shmo v'makayim b'shmo delo lache. What's the reason? Mishum delav dehavale lav she'en bo maaseh, because the lav it's not a maaseh. But haneinami lav she'bichlalotu. But the others also you can't get lashes for a different reason. They're what's called a lav she'bichlalot. Okay, a lav she'bichlalot actually has a few different interpretations, but the classic example is the one we're going to see in a minute. A lav she'bichalot is usually defined as one negative commandment that includes many different things. Now, this isn't many different things, but it's sort of many different things because the Torah right now, it's unclear which pasuk they're actually referring to because there's a lot of pasuk in the Torah that say don't worship idols. But in don't worship idols, whichever pasuk we choose, there's a lot of actions associated with it. Don't kiss, don't hug, don't this, don't that, right? And therefore, you're not going to get lashes because it's all many different things included in one verse, and on something like that, you don't get lashes for it. Now, it seems a little strange in this context, but we're going to see where it makes a lot more sense. Okay, and they're going to say this is a case of lav she'bichlelot And the fact is, you don't get lashes on the lav shebechalot. Tanya, how do we know this? Well, here we're going to go and bring a lav shebechalot. And here we're going to have a different pasuk, which is called lo tochlu al adam, don't eat on the blood. Which is very unclear what that means. Tochlu al adam, you would think means don't eat blood, but it's a little weird. Lo tochal al adam, why on the blood? What are we talking about? And you're going to have, I didn't count, but we can count as we go along, a lot of very different prohibitions that come out of this. And then you can understand why we don't get lashes, because you have to get lashes on something definitive. This could be understood in multiple different ways, and therefore, whichever way you interpret it, we're not going to get lashes for it. So let's read all the different options. Okay, I'll number them as we go so we can follow. If you eat from an animal before the animal's dead, meaning you slaughter the animal is still convulsing, it's still alive, and you start eating from it. That's forbidden. Okay? Talmud lomar lo tochlu al adam. Don't eat while the blood is still coming out. Davar acher, second interpretation. Lo tochlu al adam, lo tochlu basar va'adayin dam b'mizrach. Now we're moving to the temple. Not regular eating, but I'm in the temple. I slaughter an animal. Now you can eat the meat after you finish. But what if the blood hasn't been sprinkled? It's still in the mizrach, which is the utensil where they would collect the blood, and you haven't yet sprinkled it on the altar. You can't eat the meat yet. Okay, this is some of the meat is permitted for eating, right? Some only to kohanim, some to everyone, depends which type of korban. Anyway, again, lo tochlu al adam, because it says, right, don't eat lo tochlu basar v'adayin dam b'mizrach. Okay, when the blood is still there, where is there? It hasn't been sprinkled. Third one, Rabbi Dosa Omer, minayin she'ein mavlin al harugei beit din. Tamlomar lo tochlu al adam. If you have someone with blood on their hands, meaning, let's say they murdered someone, and they got killed because they murdered someone, and they were killed by the court, and you're their relative, you don't have what we call the sudat havra'ah. Okay, in general, you don't have avelut. We learned about that. You don't do regular mourning for them, and that's from lo tochlu al adam. Don't eat for someone who has blood on his hands or her hands. Rabbi Akiva Omer. Fourth, minayin le Sanhedrin shargu et nefesh, also associated with murder, but a Sanhedrin that kills someone, she'ein toamim klum kol hayom. They don't eat the day that they convict someone, right? That they or that they execute someone. Talmud lomar lo tochlu al adam. Don't eat while someone else is being killed. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, fifth one. Asara leben sorer umoreh minayin. How do we know that it's forbidden? Where's the lotas associated with the ben sorer umoreh? Okay, it doesn't say don't do this, don't do that, don't do that. We'll learn about ben sorer umoreh soon, a rebellious son. It just says if you have a son who does this and that, then you have to take him out to be killed. But where does it ever say that he's commanded a lotase? So we learn it from here, lo tochlu al adam. Now, what does that have to do with the ben sorer umoreh? One of the things Ben Sorer is he eats a lot of food. And why is the Ben Sorer killed? I'm going to talk about this later. Fascinating topic. It's what the Mishna calls him nidon al shem sofo. We're worried that this behavior, and it's very strange that we do this behavior might lead him to murder ultimately or to bad behaviors. So lo tochlu al adam is don't eat if it will eventually cause you to spill blood. And that's the warning to the Ben Sorer Moreh. Again, you'll understand this better when we get there. It's a bit of a strange asara to connect it to that. Okay. So there you have 5. I counted now. We have 5 different things that come out of there and you don't get lashes. So now we're stuck because Rav Dimi came and said, we don't get lashes for the lav shein b'maaseh ones, but it sounds like you do get lashes for the rest, even though it's a lav shebechalot also, because all these things come from one pasuk. Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Avin Bar Kahana, Al Kulam Eno Lokem Mishum Dehavele Lav Shebechalot. That was just ending that braita. After that braita came, they said the reason why you don't get lashes for all these things is because they're called Lav Shebechalot. And then apply that to us, and we're stuck. So Rav Dimi's version doesn't really work. Now we're going to have Ravin's version, and you can see how they got confused because they have the same split. They just go in the opposite direction. Which again, we're going to have a question, and you can probably figure out the question on your own. Elakia to Ravin Amar Rabbi Elazar. When Ravin came, he brought the Rabbi Elazar and quoted him and said, Al kulam eno lokeh, you don't get lashes for any of these, chutz min hanoder b'shmo v'kam b'shmo. Specifically, the words ones, that's where you get lashes for. Everything else you don't. So the Gemara is going to say, I don't understand. Okay, I get why you don't get lashes for all the others, because they're lav shebechlalot. Haninami, lav shein b'maaseh, but these are also lav shein b'maaseh. Both groups fit into the categories of something you don't get lashes for. So they answered, no, that's not a problem because there is an opinion. This, by the way, a little bit matches Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis. How seriously do we treat your words, right? They were arguing about korban. Here we're talking about lashes. But Rabbi Yehuda says you actually could get lashes for a lav she'ein bo ma'aseh. You do get lashes. Tanya, how do we know? Well, here we're going to talk about another thing that doesn't have an action associated with it. It doesn't have words either. Tanya. Lo tutir mimenu ad boker. There's all sorts of korbanot, right? There's a certain limit to every korban of how long it can be eaten. So you can't leave it over till the morning. Right? Sometimes you have 2 days, sometimes you have one, right? Already the next morning, sometimes you have the whole day till the following morning. The next, you have the whole day following the korban and then the morning after that. Either which way, whichever one, right? At a certain point, there's a limitation. But wait, this is what we call a lav hanitak laseh, and from here we're moving to Amud Bet, which is if I have a negative commandment that then says, what do I do if I transgress? So in this case, it says, don't leave it over till the morning. And whatever you leave, meaning you have to eat your sacrifice before the next day. But whatever you leave till the next morning, you have to burn. So it resolves it. Now, what is punishment if not a resolution of a problem, right? You do something wrong, and the way you fix it kind of thing, you don't really fix it, but the way you get atonement is by getting lashes, and that kind of provides you with the atonement. But in this case, the Torah tells you how to get atonement or how to fix the problem. Burn it. So when it tells you that, you don't get lashes. That's called a lav hanitak laseh, and there's a number of examples in the Torah of this. So Rabbi Yehuda says, why in notar, this is called, if you leave something over, do you not get lashes? Because it's a lav. It already tells you, it's a lav hanitak laseh. It already tells you how to fix it. And therefore, lomar she'en lo kinalav. So that tells you there's no malkum. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yaakov Omer, lo min Hashem who said, that's not the reason why you don't get lashes here. It's obvious why you don't get lashes here. Did you do any action here? You actually didn't do an action. That was what the problem was. You didn't eat it. So, and that's what Rabbi Yaakov says forbidden, not because it's a lav hanitak laseh, but because it's a lav she'ein bo ma'aseh. There's no action. You didn't do anything. You didn't do anything. You should have done something you didn't. So there's no action that we can punish you for. Now, the fact that Rabbi Yehuda didn't say it, because that was a more obvious one, I guess. Michlal, Rabbi Yehuda savar lo kinalav. From here, they infer that Rabbi Yehuda holds that you get lashes for this, for any lav she'ein bo ma'aseh, and then that answers our question. Now, Ravin's version works, because the two, it was clear that there was some category in the Mishnah that you do get lashes for. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, we could explain it. According to the other way, there was no way to explain it. Nobody thinks a lav shebechalot you get lashes for. So this explanation works. Continuing on with the noder b'shmo mekayem b'shmo hareze below taseh, it's a negative commandment. So now we want to know, where does this come up? Where do you see you can't vow in their name, you can't swear in their name, and we're going to learn some other things that you can't do with words. Hanoder b'shmo v'mekayem b'shmo minalan. So where do we get it from? Tanya, the Braita says, v'shem Elohim achirim lo tazkiru. Don't mention the name of the avodah zarah. What does that mean? Well, shelo yomar adam l'chabero shmor li b'tzad avodah zarah ploni. Don't use it as a landmark. Don't say, "Oh, I'll go meet you next to the temple of the idol, so and so." You don't mention their word in the context of anything, even though if it's not in the context of worshiping idols. Lo yishama al picha. Now the continuation of that pasuk, it says, right, Shem Elohim achirim lo tazkiru, don't mention, and then it says, "Lo yishama al picha," and it shouldn't be in your mouth. So, right, that's kind of saying one and the same thing, but the Torah doesn't repeat. Again, always different approaches. Torah dibrath k'lashon b'nei adam, which repeat things or not. Is this for darshaning? So they say here, why does it say lo yishama al picha? This is where we get our source from. Shelo yidor b'shmo, don't take a vow in the name of the idol. Lo yikayem b'shmo, don't make an oath. And lo yigrom la'achirim sheyidru b'shmo v'yikaymu b'shmo. Not only can you not do it, you can't cause someone else to vow in the name of an idol. We're saying, what would that be? Well, we'll see an example in a minute. But first, they bring a different interpretation of lo yishama al picha. Davar achil, lo yishama al picha asara lemesit u'lemediach. Lo yishama al picha is don't cause others to worship idols by being a mesit or a mediach. Remember, a mesit is someone who sways someone to go worship idols, individuals, and a mediach is someone who gets a whole city to do it. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, this isn't the warning for a mesit? Mesit behedek tiv be. Chol Yisrael yishmu v'yirau, v'lo yosifu nod. it already says a mesite, you can't do what you're doing, because when we kill the mesite, we make a big public spectacle so that nobody does this. In other words, it's very clear from the psukim that a mesite is not allowed to do what a mesite does. So they answer, okay, fine. This, according to the second interpretation, is warning someone to sway a whole city from worshiping idols. Because when it talks about the whole city, the Irani Dachat, it doesn't talk about it in terms of who's swaying them. It just talks about if a city all goes to worship idols. But there's nothing specifically about being mesite a whole city. And therefore, this could be understood, lo yishamal picha, don't make it that because on account of your words, other people worshipped idols. Okay. Now we're going to talk about this one line that we just mentioned, which I said we're going to need to understand what this would mean. Don't cause others to vow in the name of this idol or swear in the name of the idol. This supports the reading of Shmuel, the opinion of the father of Shmuel. Da'amar avuad Shmuel, asur la'adam she'aseh shutafut im hagoy, shema yitchayev lo shfuah, v'nishba v'odah zarah shelo. Based on this verse, the father Shmuel says basically, you can't go into a business partnership with a Gentile, because often in business partnerships, you have to end up taking oaths one to the other. And you might cause this person to take an oath in the name of their idol. Which is a very radical thing to say, because they did a lot of business with the Gentiles of their time. And, you have to think about the ramifications of this and how far this would go. Again, you could say maybe only idol worshipers and not, pagans and not other, like we talked about the Meiri says, and this doesn't apply necessarily to someone who's not an idol worshiper. Anyway, it's a quite radical statement. Okay. Now, we said you're not allowed to mention the name of idols, like don't say, oh, go meet me by this place, which is by the temple. So now we have a story. Ki'ata ula, bat bekalnevo. He slept. Bat is slept, even though bat means bat, but also in the Aramaic, it means slept. He slept in Kalnevo. Amarle Rava, vehecha batmar. So Ula started up conversation and said, where'd you sleep last night? Amarle bekalnevo. Amarle. Rava's like in shock. He says, "V'haktiv shem Elohim acharim lo tezkiru." You're not allowed to say the name of gods, and apparently Nevo is the name of an idol. Amar le hachi amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Ula says, "Oh, don't worry. Rabbi Yochanan taught me." Remember, Rav is in Babylonia. Ula comes from Israel, and he, gets into this thing, and he says, "Oh, don't worry. I have Rabbi Yochanan to rely on." What did Rabbi Yochanan say? Fascinating line. If the idol was mentioned in the Torah, meaning in the Tanakh, you're allowed to say the name. Now, part of me thinks, I didn't look up why this would be, but my instinct tells me, well, if it says in the Torah, we read the Torah all the time, we say the name when we read the Torah, we can learn Torah, even if we don't read it in shul, let's say, but, maybe if it was written there, we're allowed to say it. So now they say, okay, so where was Nevo written in the Torah? Ha hechaktiva, dirtiv kara bel kores Nevo. And that's a reference to Nevo, which is this idol. Ve'ilo ktiva lo. Wait, if it's not written, you can't say it. But what about this other city that's mentioned in a tannaitic source? Mativ Rav Misharshia ra'achat merubah keshalosh shehi kemigadyon. Gadyon is an idol. Lishilo shem shtei tefilot u'shnei sifugin. Okay, this is a whole out of context topic. If you are a zav is a man who has a discharge, and if he sees 3 times this discharge, he becomes a zav. By the Torah, you have to bring a sacrifice. But if he had one long discharge that lasted the time that would take you to walk from Gadyon to Shiloh, or the time it would take to do 2 tefillas in the mikveh and dry yourself twice, then that's a zav gamor. Okay, this is when they didn't have watches. They couldn't say whatever amount of time they wanted to say. They described it in words. And look, they used Gadyon, which is a god that's not mentioned in the Torah. So Amar Ravina Gad Nami Michtav Tiva. What do you mean it is written? Dichtiv ha'orchim legad shulchan. Okay, there are those who set out the table for God, and their God is a God, and Gadyon comes from that. It is in the Torah. Don't worry. Okay. Amar Rav Nachman. Now, if we already quoted the pasuk Kara Bel Kores Nivo, we're now going to darshan that pasuk. So Amar Rav Nachman, and learn a halacha from it. Kol leit sanuta asira. You can't mock really anything. It's disrespectful. The only thing you can mock and make fun of is avodah zarah, idols. How do we know this? Because look at the pasuk, kara bel kores nevo, which they explain as karsu karu yachdav lo yachlu malet masa. Okay, this is another pasuk about it. and it shows here kores karu, they went down, v'lo yachlu malei masad, they couldn't avoid the burden from coming out of them. What they basically want to say is these idols defecated all over the place. They couldn't control themselves. And that was the way the Jews made fun of the idols. Oh, look at these idols. They're defecating all over the place. They can't control themselves. And the same idea comes up in Dibrula Eglot Beit Avin Yagul Shchan Shomron Ki Aval Alav Amo Uchmarav Alav Yagilu Al Kvodo Ki Galam Imenu. This seems to be talking about the Eglot of Beit Avin, which are these also gods, idols, that they mourn them when they basically were taken into captivity. But the way they explained it is kvodo, that they mourned and they were upset about the loss of respect. Ela kvedo. What they were saying is their koved, the heaviness of their masa. Again, the same idea. That, well, there's different ways of understanding this pasuk. Okay, so if you have an interpretation, you might have a different one in your book, but I'm going to interpret it in the same way as the previous, which is the kvedo, the heaviness was coming out all the time, and they couldn't control their waste. It's coming out all the time. Okay, so that's allowed to mock them. Now we're going to talk about other ways that people worship the idols. And they're just quoting psukim from Tanakh. Okay, so they continued to sin. They made masecha from their money. Kitfunam atzabim. So what is this kitfunam atzabim? My kitfunam atzabim. Yirato. Remember we said Yirah is the god. They made a demut of their god, their idol. So they left it in their pocket. Whenever they would remember it, they would take out the image. They would hug it and kiss it. And this was a different thing. Okay, people who slaughtered animals kissed calves. Okay, what are we talking about? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Debei Rabbi Ami, Shayu Kmarim. There were these Kmarim. There were priests of the idols. The idols were the animals, the agalim. They wanted the money of all these rich people. So what did they do? This is a very creative idea. They took the agalim, the calves. They starved them. And what they did is, osim demut atzabim umamidam betoch bitzad avusehem, where they wanted to eat from their troughs, they put pictures of all the wealthy people. And the animals were starving. And what would they do? They'd look at the pictures of the wealthy people. And it was specifically in the place where they got their food from. Umotzi'inotam lachutz, then they would let them out and they would be starved. Kevan she'ra'u, and then on the street, they would see the people whose faces they recognized from the pictures. Right? They didn't have photographs, but I guess they drew them well enough that the animals recognized them. And then they would be ratzina charehem umashbashim, and they would run up to them and start touching them. And then the komarim would say to them, the priests would say, oh, look, these idols want you. It must be you are the one chosen to slaughter to basically sacrifice yourself to the idols, and you have to kill yourself for this idol. And then these rich people would listen. What happens to rich people's money when they sacrifice themselves to the idols? Obviously, the money goes to the temple. And these priests would steal the money. And that was how they would get this money. And that's why it says, Zovchei Adam, Agalim Yishakun, because the Agalim, the calves would nuzzle up to them and kiss them. And Zovchei Adam, and then they would slaughter themselves. So Rava says, what are you talking about? Hi, Zovchei Adam, Agalim Yishakun, it's the wrong order. Agalim Yishakun, Lizboch Adam. Right? The Agalim would kiss them in order to create that the people would sacrifice themselves. It's the reverse order. That Mebaile should have said. Ella Amar Rava said, now, it wasn't that people would sacrifice themselves. So Adam is not themselves, it's their sons, which we see in Tanakh, right, for the Molech especially. People would sacrifice their son to the Molech. And if you would do such a thing, they would say to you, Omerlo, Doron Gadol Hikrivlo, wow, you gave such a nice gift to the idol that you gave your son, Yavovi Yishaklo. Now you're allowed to go kiss the animal. And that's Zovchei Adam, get to Agalim Yishakun, they can kiss the Agalim. And that's a different interpretation. Amar Rav Yudan. Now we're just going to read a bunch of psukim and say, what was this idol? Okay, and we're going to see they were all different animals. Okay, Anshe Bavel asu et Sukkot Benot, Mainihu Tarnegolet. Sukkot Benot is like going over, right, putting a schach, like a protection over your children. It's like the hen that sits over her eggs. Vanshe Kut asu et Nargal, Mainihu Tarnegol, because of the letters, or Nargal is like Tarnegol. Anshe Chamat asu et Ashima. What is Ashima? Barcha Karcha. It's a bald goat. Avim asu nivcham ve'et tartak. Maini, what are those? Kelev v'chamor, dog and a donkey. Hasafarvim sorfim b'neim, the Safarvim would burn their sons, ba'esh, in fire, la'adar melech, va'anam melech. Elohei Safarvim, those were the gods of the Safarvim. Mainu hapere v'asus, the mule and the horse. Adar melech, why is that the mule? Da adar le lamare b'ti'ina. Adar melech, it would be glory to its master because it carried things for it. That's the mule. Ana melech da ani le lamare bekrave. What were horses used for? Battle. They would basically they would be the ana melech. It would answer its master in war. It would be there for wartime. And av Chizkiyahu melech Yehuda bikesh aviv la'asot lo kain. Chizkiyahu melech, his father, tried to give him over to this god. His mother saved him by putting salamander oil. You might remember we've talked about the salamander. They believe the salamander was inflammable. And basically it says in the Torah that Achaz, in the Tanakh, that Achaz offered his son to the gods, and they assume it was Chizkiyahu because we don't see he had any other sons, and we assume obviously Chizkiyahu made it. How did he make it? He must have had the salamander oil put on by his mother. Okay, last thing for today. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Yud Ima Yisrael b'avodas zara she'ein ba mamash. This is a fascinating line. Jews don't really think of avodas zara as anything. Okay, there's no big desire to worship avodas zara. Now, where is there the biggest desire of people to sin? Sexual relations. So they say lo avdu avodas zara ela latir lahem arayot b'for hesya. Why they worship idols? Because if they went that way, they wouldn't have, God and his word telling them don't go to arayot. They went toward the idols, that would be able to enable them to feel okay about engaging in forbidden sexual relations. So the real desire is in sexual relations and not in avodah zarah. So we're going to have several questions on this. We'll start with the first one today. Mativ Rav Misharsha, kazachur b'nehem is b'chotam. Sounds like the way you remember your sons, that's how they remember their mizbechot for the idols. It sounds like they really desired it. And he explains it like the way someone misses a lost son. That's how they felt about their idols. So it sounds like they did desire it. To which the answer, batar da avikube. That what motivated them in the first place? The arayot. They weren't really desiring it. Once they started, then they got hooked in, and then they really were connected, and then they desired it much more. Okay, Tashma, the second one, we'll just start, although we won't really get very far, because we're not going to get to the main point. But natati pigrechem al pigrei gelulechem. It's pasuk. Now, what are we going to darshan from this? We'll explain the whole drasha tomorrow, but they're going to start with this thing. Amar Eliyahu tzaddik hayam chazer al tfuchei rav shebYerushalayim. Okay, Eliyahu would go visit people who were malnourished in Jerusalem after the destruction. Pam achad matzah tinok she'at tafuach u'mutav b'ashpa. He found a young child whose body was swelled and thrown in the garbage. Amar lo me'ez mishpachata, what family are you from? Amar lo mishpacha plonitani, from this family. Amar lo klum nishtei me'otam mishpacha, anything left from that family? Amar lo lav chutz mimenu, I'm the only one left. Amar lo imanim alamdecha davar she'ata chai bo ata lamed, do you want something to help you survive? Amar lo hein, he said yes. Amar lo amor b'chol yom Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. He said every day you should say Shema Yisrael. Okay, we're going to wait till tomorrow to see the rest of the story, and we'll see what this has anything to do with our topic. Why it's going to be brought as a question to what people didn't really desire of avodah zarah. Okay, so very quickly we started with, finished up the heelucha. We saw this one opinion that really there is only one that disagrees with Abaye. Then we saw this Rav said, Eliyatad, you're going to be chayav. We said must be chayav korban, and then we discussed that. Whose opinion does it coincide with? We got a little off on a tangent about the golden calf and darshaning the psukim there. Then we got into this. All those actions in the Mishna, and we divided it in two. Some you got lashes, some you don't. We had two different versions. Which one? What? We got to lav shein b'masa and lav shebechlalot. In the end, we explained it like Rabbi Yehuda, who thinks lav shein b'masa you do get lashes, and then you would get for those. And then we got into those about the swearing and all that, and we got into some other things that you can't do with the name of avodah zarah, like not get other people to use the name of avodah zarah. And then from there, we got into different ways, right? Different names that you could say of avodah zarah because they're in the Torah, and the different ways that people worship idols. And then ended with this idea about, is there really a desire for avodah zarah or not? Fascinating topic. And with that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.